It was a quiet, somber afternoon at the National Cemetery. The wind whispered through the trees, and rows of headstones stretched out as far as the eye could see, a sacred place where honor and sacrifice were remembered. Among the few visitors paying their respects was a woman dressed in a modest jacket and jeans, her stance calm but commanding. What most didn't know, however, was that she was a decorated Air Force veteran, someone who had faced challenges most of us could never imagine. As she knelt to place flowers on a grave, the peace of the moment was shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycles. A group of bikers rolled into the cemetery, loud, brash, and completely unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, about the sanctity of their surroundings. Their presence wasn't just disruptive, it was intimidating. They carried themselves with an air of arrogance, as if they owned the place, laughing and jeering loudly, ignoring the quiet reverence of others nearby. One of the bikers, a tall man with a leather vest and an attitude to match, seemed to take notice of the woman. Maybe it was her calm demeanor, or the way she refused to react to their antics. Whatever it was, he decided to test her patience. The other bikers followed his lead, circling closer, their voices growing louder and more taunting. Most people might have felt a pang of fear or helplessness at being surrounded like this, but not her. No, she remained composed, her sharp eyes steady as if calculating her next move. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat. What happened next was something none of them saw coming. In a matter of moments, this seemingly ordinary woman would remind them, and everyone else watching, that appearances can be deceiving and respect is earned, not taken. As the bikers circled closer, their laughter grew louder, filling the quiet cemetery with a grating tension. It was clear they were testing her, trying to provoke a reaction. The leader, wearing a vest covered in patches, smirked as he leaned forward on his handlebars, his voice cutting through the noise. "Hey, lady, this your spot? You look too tough to be out here crying over someone," he jeered, his tone dripping with mockery. His buddies chuckled, egging him on. But she didn't answer. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate, as if weighing every step. Her eyes remained locked on the leader, calm but unyielding. The silence that followed seemed to unsettle them, though they didn't show it. The other visitors in the cemetery had started to notice, their concerned glances darting between the woman and the bikers. But no one stepped in. They didn't need to. She didn't look like she needed saving. One of the younger bikers, emboldened by his group, shouted, "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or you just scared?" Still, she said nothing. Her posture remained strong, her hands resting loosely at her sides, but there was something about the way she carried herself that made the air feel heavier. It wasn't anger or fear, it was control. The leader dismounted his bike, his boots crunching against the gravel. He strutted toward her, his grin widening, but even as he loomed closer, her composure didn't waver. "Listen, sweetheart, you're in the wrong place if you think you're gonna ignore us." Her gaze never left his. Then, in a voice as steady as steel, she finally spoke. "You don't know who you're messing with." The words hung in the air, striking a chord that neither he nor his gang had expected. The tension thickened as the cemetery seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The leader of the bikers paused for a moment, clearly thrown off by her calm but cutting words. He'd expected fear or anger, anything but this unshakable composure. His smirk faltered, but only briefly. He straightened up, playing it off as he glanced back at his crew for support. The woman tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Someone who's seen more than you'll ever know. The way she said it wasn't boastful, but it carried weight, as if those words came from somewhere deep. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. The others in the group shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in the air but unsure of what to do. One of the older bikers, a man with a grizzled beard, muttered, "Maybe we should just leave her alone, man. It's a cemetery after all." But the leader wasn't about to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. "Nah, she's just trying to act tough," he said, brushing off the warning. Turning back to her, he sneered, "You think you're special or something? This isn't the military, lady. You don't scare me. At the mention of the military, her expression hardened ever so slightly. It was subtle, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. She took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. At the mention of the military, her expression hardened ever so slightly. It was subtle, but enough for anyone paying attention to notice. She took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. "You're right," she said, her voice steady but cold. "This isn't the military. If it were, you wouldn't last 5 seconds." The tension was unbearable now, like the calm before a storm. The other bikers watched nervously, unsure if their leader had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. And then she added, her tone sharp as a blade, "But since you've made it your business to find out, I'll give you exactly what you're asking for." The leader hesitated, his bravado faltering as he realized too late that he had underestimated her. The moment felt electric, charged with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. The leader stood frozen for a moment, her words cutting through his arrogance like a knife. The smirk he'd been wearing was gone now, replaced by an uneasy expression he was desperately trying to mask. He glanced back at his crew for support, but even they seemed hesitant, the earlier confidence in their laughter now reduced to a nervous quiet. The woman didn't wait for him to respond. She stepped forward again, closing the gap completely. The air between them felt heavy, charged with tension. Her gaze bore into his, unrelenting. "You walk into this place, a sacred ground, and think you can act like you own it? Like respect doesn't matter here." Her voice was low but firm, each word measured and deliberate. "You've already made your first mistake. Don't make another." The leader tried to laugh it off, but it sounded hollow, more forced than before. "Lady, you've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're way out of your league." She didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Out of my league?" she repeated. "You're standing in a place dedicated to people who gave everything, who stood for something bigger than themselves. Tell me, what have you ever stood for?" His jaw tightened, the bravado slipping further away. The weight of her words seemed to hit harder than he wanted to admit. One of the younger bikers muttered, "Maybe we should just go, man. This is getting weird." But before the leader could respond, she took one step closer, now standing just inches away. "I've faced people tougher, louder and meaner than you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried a gravity that silenced everything around them. "And I didn't back down then. What makes you think you were any different?" The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, the tension mounting as they realized they had underestimated her. The cemetery, once filled with their raucous noise, had fallen eerily silent, the stage set for a confrontation none of them were prepared for. The silence lingered heavy and suffocating, as if even the wind had paused to see what would happen next. The leader of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, the tension now more than he could ignore. His gang, once loud and confident, seemed to shrink in their places, exchanging glances that said everything. They had crossed a line, and they all knew it. But just as he opened his mouth to say something, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the stillness. Everyone turned to see a sleek black car pulling up a few rows away. Its polished exterior reflected the sunlight, and as it came to a stop, the door opened. Out stepped a man in uniform, an older gentleman with sharp features, his presence commanding without effort. The insignia on his jacket made it clear he wasn't just any serviceman. The woman didn't look surprised. In fact, her expression softened slightly, almost as if she'd been expecting him. The man approached with calm, measured steps, his gaze moving briefly over the bikers before settling on her. "Everything all right here, Captain?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "Captain." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap, and the bikers froze. The woman gave a small nod, her stance still unyielding. "I've got it under control, Colonel," she replied, her tone respectful but unwavering. The leader of the bikers took a step back, his bravado now completely gone. "Wait a minute," he stammered, looking between her and the colonel. "You're military." The colonel's eyes narrowed as he addressed the group, his voice sharp as a blade. "You're trespassing on hallowed ground, disrupting the peace of those who gave their lives for this country. I suggest you leave. Now." The bikers looked at each other, their earlier arrogance now replaced with panic. But before they could move, the woman stepped forward again, her voice cutting through their nervous whispers. "Not so fast," she said, her tone colder now. "You wanted my attention. Now you've got it." The bikers stood frozen, realizing they'd just made a terrible mistake. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension as the stakes rose even higher, the confrontation far from over. The bikers stood rooted in place, their earlier bravado completely drained. The woman's commanding presence, paired with the colonel's arrival, had turned the tables in a way they hadn't anticipated. The leader opened his mouth, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Look, we didn't mean any disrespect. We were just messing around," he mumbled, his voice shaky. "Messing around," the colonel echoed, his tone razor-sharp. "You think this is a place for games? Every name on these headstones represents someone who made the ultimate sacrifice. This ground deserves respect, not your arrogance." The woman stepped closer to the leader, her eyes locked on his. "You came here looking for trouble, and now you're caught in the middle of it," she said, her voice quiet but piercing. "But here's the thing about people like me. We don't walk away from a fight. We finish it." The leader looked away, unable to hold her gaze. His crew shuffled uncomfortably, clearly wanting to leave but too scared to make a move without him. The tension hung thick in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like everything was about to explode. Then the unexpected happened. From behind one of the rows of headstones, a small group of veterans emerged. Men and women of various ages, some in uniforms, others in civilian clothing, but all with the same unshakable presence. They'd been visiting the cemetery, quietly observing from a distance. Now they stood united, their eyes fixed on the bikers. One of the older veterans, a man with a prosthetic leg and a face weathered by time, stepped forward. "You're lucky," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're standing in front of people who understand restraint, but don't mistake it for weakness." The bikers, overwhelmed and outnumbered, began backing away. The leader stammered, "We didn't mean any harm. We'll leave." As they scrambled to their bikes, the woman watched them go, her stance unwavering. But just before they sped off, she called out, her voice carrying across the cemetery. "Next time you think about disrespecting a place like this, remember this moment, because next time you might not get to walk away." The bikers rolled off, their noise fading into the distance. The veterans gathered around the woman, offering quiet nods of respect. The colonel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Well handled, Captain," he said. "Shoulder. Well handled, Captain," he said. She turned back toward the grave she'd been visiting, her expression softening. "It wasn't just for me," she said quietly. "It was for all of them." As the group dispersed, the cemetery returned to its peaceful stillness. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the rows of headstones. But in that silence, there was a sense of triumph, a reminder that even in the face of arrogance, respect and honor would always prevail. And as the woman stood alone once more, paying her respects, there was one last twist. A folded note lay on the headstone she'd visited, the words written in a familiar hand. Asterisk, keep standing tall. You're never alone, asterisk. She smiled faintly, knowing exactly who had left it.